Having spent a week primarily in Western Turkey recently, I thought I'd use a lesson for East Kilbride to show some of the sites we visited and to make some application from the Bible of some of what we learned while traveling to places mentioned in the Bible. Our tour was organized by Ian Stars and centered around visiting the cities where the letters to congregations from Revelation 2 and 3 were located, although we visited a couple of other sites as we traveled, as well as a few sites of interest that did not have a biblical connection. We left on the 4th day of November 2024. A group of 17 met at Edinburgh Airport, and we flew to Istanbul to spend a week touring sites related to the New Testament. In Istanbul, we were joined by 4 Christians from the United States, as well as 6 more from England. Turkey, by the way, is 3 hours ahead of the UK as far as time is concerned, so we had to get some adjustment to our bodies. We were also joined by a Turkish tour guide who's able to not only talk about the sites we visited, but to also let us know quite a bit about living in Turkey. One of the first things you notice while traveling the 25 miles from the airport to our hotel in the old city was that we were not in the UK. There are mosques everywhere. Some are large, like this one, some are fairly small. In Istanbul alone, there are over 3,000 mosques, and that's for a huge city of almost 16 million. This was the mosque that was almost across the street from our hotel in Istanbul. There was actually another smaller one at the end of the short street going the other direction. And yes, I was awakened every morning about 6 o'clock by the call to prayer. We quickly learned that this was not a Christian country in any way, shape, or form, at least religiously. We spent our first day on a tour of Istanbul. We began at the Hagia Sophia. This building was completed, minus the minarets, in 537 AD and was a cathedral of Constantinople. It remained a cathedral until Constantinople fell in 1453 to the Ottoman Empire. When it was built, this was the largest interior space in the world. It remained the largest until the Seville Cathedral was completed in 1520. From 1453, it became a mosque and remained so until 1931. At that time, it was renovated and became a museum. Any Christian symbols, when it became a mosque, were either removed or plastered over. In the 1920s, 1930s, with the overthrow of the Ottoman Empire, Turkey became a secular state with a separation of church and state to bring Turkey more into line with its neighboring European countries. Our guide described Turkey as the most eastern Western nation, as well as the most Western Eastern nation, and that is a pretty good explanation. 99% of the population of Turkey are Muslims, but Friday, which is the Muslim day of worship, is a work day like it is in any European country. So attendance at mosques on Friday is low, except for special days. Sharia law was also outlawed when it became a secular state. In fact, until recently, women could not wear the head covering, the complete head covering, but that was allowed in recent years as well. In 1935, when the building was opened as a museum, the Christian artwork was revealed once again. In 2019, in fact, the Hagia Sophia was Turkey's most visited tourist attraction. In 2020, the building was reclassified as a mosque, with the downstairs now a mosque and the upper levels a Christian museum. Within easy walking distance is a mosque we also visited, known as the Blue Mosque. Officially, it's called the Sultan Ahmed Mosque. It was completed in 1617, and it includes the Sultan's tomb. It's a very large and it's a very beautiful building, and it is a functioning mosque. It has lots of stained glass, lots of tiles. Now, why do I mention mosques in a lesson for Sunday? Well, there are a few lessons I think we can learn from this. What was once a predominantly Christian nation is now a Muslim nation. What happened? I suggest, first of all, it should be fairly obvious that Christians weren't doing what they should, and they ended up being eradicated. With it being a Muslim nation for 700 years, Christianity was driven out. Having said that, they now have a separation of church and state, although the state provides for the upkeep of the mosques. In fact, they even control what the imam speaks about on Fridays. And all mosques are given the exact same lesson to give, which is about social issues and not teaching on anything religious. And perhaps that tells us that having the state in control of religion is not a good thing because of the control they give while claiming separation. I found that interesting. But I must move on because I don't want to spend time talking about mosques. On Wednesday morning, we left our hotel, visited the Topkapi Palace. That's where the sultans lived for 700 years. Turkey, under the Ottoman Empire, was ruled by one hereditary line of rulers. Within the grounds of Topkapi Palace is another ancient church building, Hagia Irene. The current building was built in 548 AD. Now, the name means simply holy peace, and it's one of the few church buildings that was never converted into a mosque. It is currently under renovation. Couldn't see a whole lot in it, but we were able to shoot some photos from the side. You can see some of the cross there and some of how the building was laid out. But it currently serves as a museum and a concert hall. We then left Istanbul and to head to Western Turkey. And that's where we spent the rest of our time, was in Western Turkey. We drove from Istanbul to Kanaki. That's a distance of about 200 miles. It took us about 4 to 5 hours plus a stop for lunch. Now, if you notice there on the map, on the left-hand side, we passed through Gallipoli. That's where the World War I battle, where so many lost their lives, took place. We stopped at a war memorial, a graveyard, cemetery. The impact of the battle, when you look at the gravestones, all the men having died in 1915, sheer numbers of both sides that were slaughtered was immense. The Great War was to be the war to end all wars. But sadly, over 100 years later, humans still haven't learned, have they? We spent the night in Katakali, not one of the best of hotels, but it was near this Trojan horse. Now, you may recognize this Trojan horse. It's the one from the film Troy, which starred Brad Pitt. The next morning, we visited the site of Troy. It's about 20 miles drive from where we'd stayed. This is a site where Troy had various levels of archaeology because the town's been built on and built on and built on. 7 different layers. It was interesting, but it's the last of the non-biblical sites that we visited. If you watch the film Troy, as we did once we were back, the Troy that they depict is a whole lot bigger than the Troy actually was. They said that the real Troy just wasn't big enough for the film they wanted to make, so their depiction of it was a whole lot larger. But it was a very important site of world history. We then drove down the coast 22 miles to the excavations at Troas. This is where Paul ended up when he was trying to figure out where he should go to tell others about Jesus in Acts 16. That time, Luke was living here, and he ended up joining Paul's company. You can see that in the way Acts 16 is worded. But this is the one site that, as I set foot in it, chills went up my spine. This is where Paul had what we call the Macedonian call, that vision of the man from Macedonia saying to come there and help them. And Paul and company set off for Macedonia and ended up in Philippi. The sea would have been a lot further inland in the first century. This photo here is actually looking at the harbor where all those trees are, but the river has silted up, and so the sea's a little bit further out. But this is looking towards Macedonia. This is also where, a few years later, Eutychus fell out of the window while Paul was speaking. It wasn't this house, by the way, at least as far as we know. But this site only began to be excavated a few years ago, so not much has yet been exposed. In the trees that surround it, the groves of trees, you can see some, like the gates of Troas, still exposed. But they've not had a chance to do much archaeology. So there's where we had driven, ending up at Troas. We then left Troas and drove to Pergamum, which was a distance of about 115 miles. Pergamum is very much the city set on a hill, 1,100 feet high. In fact, we rode a cable car to get to the top. Pergamum had temples all around it. There is a temple to Zeus, it's not this one, as well as one to Athena. Later, this was built, or there was built a temple to Trajan, and then the temple to Hadrian. It was very much a pagan city. The hill and the area of the town was about a half-mile wide and 3.5 miles from north to south, had a population of about 200,000. It obviously spilled over from the hilltop onto the slopes surrounding it. As we wandered over the site, it dawned on me, there is a community of Christians who also lived here, who were serving God. When John recorded the letter from Jesus to Pergamum, he described it as the place where Satan had his throne. I think sometimes we think we have it bad living in our society, but I would suggest not nearly as bad as the Christians in Pergamum had. Antipas had already been killed. The photo here it's the agora, and the structure sticking up the back is where the temple to Athena would have been. One thing we see about all of this is that being a Christian in the first century was not a safe thing to do. Antipas being put to death, and plus the Christians also had to contend with those who wanted to compromise with pagan worship. I mean, there's so much of it going on around. I would assume that this is also especially talking about the worship of the emperor. In the letter to Pergamum, Jesus told those beginning to drift away to change, or he would come against them with the sword of his mouth. That's very much the theater there in Pergamum. It's a Greek theater. We learned the difference between a Greek and a Roman theaters. The Greeks built onto the hillside using the natural lay of the land for the theater, which makes a lot of sense. The Romans tended to build theaters on pillars and things like that. From Pergamum, we drove to Izmir, which is ancient Smyrna, and that's where we spent the night, a distance of about 75 miles. We began the next day visiting the ancient site of Smyrna. The city began on the hill to the left, you can just see there. By the first century, much of the commerce was here in the valley. Although the city was very wealthy, and you can see the streets here where the markets were underneath those arches, but see, the Christians weren't. They were poor. And maybe they were feeling a bit down because of it. But in his letter to them, Jesus said, although they physically were poor, in reality, they were rich. We also know there's a Jewish population here, as Jesus referred to the Jews as being in reality the synagogue of Satan. They were going through a hard time, but Jesus told them to be faithful, even if it meant death, and they would receive the victor's crown, the crown of life. From there, we drove to ancient Sardis. That was a distance of about 55 miles. There wasn't anything from the first century that's been excavated in Sardis, but there were two major structures of interest. The first, pictured here, was a huge synagogue. You notice the mosaic floors they've uncovered and the carpets they have down so we don't walk on them. Some of it is still being restored as well. At the front of the synagogue on the left is where, underneath that little balcony archway, is where the Torah would have been kept. It's a huge synagogue, and the size of the synagogue would indicate that there ended up being a major Jewish population here. Beside the synagogue, literally right beside it, was the Roman gymnasium. Now, much of the training of the athletes would have been done here in the foreground, and they did that without wearing any clothing. And next door is a Jewish synagogue. Can you imagine the problems that may have caused? The doorway you see in the middle of the structure led to the Roman baths. They have one of them uncovered. This is the frigidarium, the cold pool, where we get the word frigid, obviously. But that's about all they had really extensively uncovered. There's a lot of detail that you can see on the front of the gymnasium. What do we know about the Christians in the first century in Sardis? Well, Jesus said they had the reputation of being alive. Maybe there was an earlier gymnasium here as well. And they had the reputation of being alive. But he said in reality, they were dead. They needed to remember what they've been taught and hold on to it. Although he said there were a few who were still faithful. From here, we traveled to Alasahir. That's the site of Roman Philadelphia, a trip of about 30 miles. There's nothing archaeologically here except for a basilica, a church building, built many years later. There's nothing from the first century. Philadelphia, though, if you remember, was commended for keeping Jesus' words and not denying him despite having little strength. They had doors opened. Jesus told them that he would be with them despite what they were about to go through, and they needed to hold on to what they had. If victorious, he would make them a pillar of God's temple. When we arrived back at the coach, there was water coming out of it due to, I believe it was the burst hose at that point. We ended up with two problems with our coach. What you can't tell from this map is that when we left there, we were traveling in quite steep mountains. The bus ended up overheating. The distance we had to travel from Alasahir to Pamukkale was about 55 miles, should have been just over an hour's drive. We ended up, I think, sitting at least twice that amount of time at the roadside. We were rescued finally, got into Pamakule, and I can't remember if it was the next day or the day after that our bus ended up being replaced. They had several faults on it, which just happened. I mean, those things do happen to our own cars, even. Our hotel we stayed in Pamakule was very close to the site of Hierapolis. Hierapolis was known for its natural thermal hot springs. Today you can see the fields of calcium carbonate that have been left because of this. This was a spa area of the Roman world. There are still waters that a person can swim in amongst fallen Roman pillars. You can see those in the photograph there. The pillars, by the way, have fallen due to earthquakes in the distant past. But if you look closely, you can see steam rising off the water. Now, you might be thinking, I don't remember Hierapolis being one of the 7 churches of Asia. And I don't remember Paul writing a letter to them either. And you would be correct on both accounts. Hierapolis is mentioned in Paul's letter to the Christians in Colossae. And into that letter, he writes, Epaphras, who is one of you and a servant of Christ Jesus, sends greetings. He's always wrestling in prayer for you that you may stand firm in all the will of God, mature and fully assured. I vouch for him that he's working hard for you and for those at Laodicea and Hierapolis. From that little statement there, we know that there is a community of Christians in Hierapolis. There are 3 Roman cities very close to each other: Hierapolis, Laodicea, and Colossae. They were within a few hours' walk of each other in the valleys of the Meander and Lycus rivers. The site at Hierapolis is large, although not everything has been excavated. This is at the end of one end of the site. It's the Roman gates, with the Roman street you can see through the gates that led into the city in the 1st century. Hierapolis had a temple to Apollo, so very much a pagan city. There was a theater. It's been renovated, and it's quite spectacular. The stage area, the curtain would have been probably at least another layer on top of that, if not another one on top of that, that would have been used in the performances. And they also have what they referred to as the gates to the underworld, and that's what's there depicted. They thought this led down to the underworld. They worshipped pagan gods there as well. It is said that the Apostle Philip lived here and was martyred here, and that this is where he was buried. Eventually, a basilica was built over it. So it was quite a sight to see. We then drove from Hierapolis to what we call Laodicea. This is the Roman street. And going into, they refer to this, by the way, as Laodicea. That's the Roman street. They actually laid a marble street from Laodicea to Ephesus. That was 120 miles away. Can you imagine that? Laying a marble road for 120 miles. Laodicea has been extensively excavated over the past 5 years or so. It's an excavation that is ongoing. As I mentioned, there's these 3 cities, Hierapolis, Laodicea, and Colossae, all there clustered together in these valleys. And from Laodicea, you can see the other 2. If you looked one direction, you could see Hierapolis, remember, known for its hot springs. And you can see there in the distance of the picture, the white fields of calcium carbonate. It was 7.5 miles away. That would have taken about 2.5 hours or so to walk. And if you looked just to the right of this, you'd be looking towards Colossae. Colossae was at the foot of these mountains. There's no archaeology here, so we didn't visit it. It was just under 13 miles away, maybe about a four hour or slightly longer walk. Colossae, by the way, was known for its very cold water due to the mountains. And when Jesus sent the letter to Laodicea, he made a play on this. He said, I know your deeds, that you are neither cold nor hot. I wish you were either one or the other. So because you are lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, I'm about to spit you out of my mouth. You say, I am rich, I've acquired wealth, and do not need a thing. But you do not realize that you are wretched, pitiful, poor, blind, and naked. I counsel you to buy from me gold refined in the fire, so that you can become rich, and the white clothes to wear, so that you can cover your shameful nakedness, and salve to put on your eyes, so that you can see. Jesus then went on to say that he had stood at their door and knocked, and wanted them to let him in. This was one of two congregations that Jesus had nothing good to say about. Laodicea was a wealthy city. That's reflected in what Jesus said. In the photo here, we have the western agora of the city. The agora is where everything happened. There were markets. You debated politics. You had discussions. You name it, it took place in the agora. This is a temple. It's actually from the 2nd century AD, so just after Jesus sent that letter. But again, the indication that this was very much a pagan city. In fact, just walking along across this site, you could look down and see artifacts still buried in the ground. Yes, we left that one there. From this photo, you can see how much still has to be done. This is the other end of that marble street. But you notice on the left, they've only excavated so far, and notice how tall that is, that they had to excavate to get down to the street level. So this is an ongoing archaeological site. There was a Roman wall. It was covered because it still had the paint on it, which I found absolutely fascinating. This is a close-up section of that wall. You can see some of what it would have looked like in the 1st century. I get the feeling that this was in pieces, and they sort of put together a huge jigsaw puzzle, and it would have been very much a puzzle. But you can see the detail. Looks like they painted what looked like portraits at the top, and you've got a pillar going down through part of it. And notice though, in one of the frames there in the center, fish painted. But fascinating wall there. There's a Greek amphitheater. It's been restored, so to look like it would have looked in the 1st and 2nd centuries. This restoration was completed in 2022. It could have sat about 8,000 people there, so it's quite a large theater. There is another Greek theater there as well. It's not been restored, but this shows you a little bit of what it looks like before they begin restoring. Again, both of these Greek theaters built into the hillside. There's also a church building. Now, this dates from the 4th century AD, so well past biblical times. But it's been recently excavated and opened so that you can walk through it. Of interest was the fact that it contains a baptistry for full immersion. Notice the shape of it. It's shaped like a cross. Many of the baptistries of that era were. This building was built in the 300s. Paul wrote a letter to the Christians in Laodicea. That's mentioned at the end of Colossians as well. And he said that those in Colossae should read the letter he wrote to Laodicea, and those at Laodicea should read the one sent to Colossae as well. We then boarded the coach and headed to Kusadasi. which is near Ephesus. Ended up being the worst hotel we ever stayed in. After one night, the tour company transferred us to a better one for the remainder of the tour. But on Sunday, we toured Ephesus. We entered Ephesus from the eastern gates. That was where the political center of the city was. The photo here is the small amphitheater, where the assembly for Ephesus would meet and debate. Sort of reminds you of the layout of the Senate and Congress in the United States. Whereas in the Parliament, we face each other in the UK and debate face to face. We were then able to walk the main street of the city, going downhill from one end to the other. And there has been a lot of excavation that's taken place in Ephesus, and its excavation is still ongoing. It was very much a pagan city. Nike was worshipped, and there's the statue to Nike that they had there in Ephesus. They also worshipped emperors. This is a slightly later than first century temple. This was to the Emperor Hadrian. And side streets still being worked on. Photographed up that side street, but you can notice the sign, "Do not go in." So they're still doing a lot of excavation there. In other areas, you can see terraced housing. The building that's most remembered is the Library of Celsius. This was commissioned in 110 AD, but many think that this area was that of learning, and that possibly the school of Tyrannus, where Paul lectured, was on the left of this photo. We don't know for sure. The facade here has been reconstructed. They put it back together in the 1970s, but it's believed when this library was in the first century, second century rather, that it contained around 12,000 scrolls. On the steps leading up to the library is some graffiti. Notice they had a Jewish community. There's a Jewish menorah there carved into the steps. The street from the library led to the amphitheater, the one that's mentioned in Acts chapter 19. You can see it in the distance on the right, that bit that's sticking up from the mountainside there. It was closed the Sunday we were there, either for further renovations or possibly something being set up. I think it was further renovations. But if you remember, this is where the citizens of Ephesus, who were upset about Paul's message about one God, sat and chanted, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," for about 2 hours. This shows the full extent of the theater. It's taken from down below it. It was quite a huge theater. Can you imagine that theater being full of people simply chanting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," for 2 hours? It would have echoed, especially down Harbor Street, which is in front of you there, uh, as well as into other parts of Ephesus. In Jesus' letter to Ephesus in Revelation, he talked positively about their unwillingness to put up with wicked people and those who claimed to be apostles but weren't. But he said they had lost their first love. They had fallen, and they needed to change and get back to doing what they had originally done. We worshiped that Sunday on the outskirts of ancient Ephesus in the ruins of St. Mary Church. This is where the Council of Ephesus was held in 431 AD to determine the status of Mary, whether she should be referred to as God bearer or just Christ bearer. And God bearer is what they decided on, and hence she's known today, especially by the Roman Catholics, as the Mother of God. We worshiped at the back part of the site, worship surrounding this baptistry. Yes, that is me speaking. And from what we understand, the Council of Ephesus very well could have been held in that particular area. We also visited the site where the Apostle John was said to have lived and where he was buried. They say that his grave was marked by a simple wooden cross. A basilica was built over it centuries later. So it was quite neat visiting that. Very well could be where John was buried. And again, within that basilica, there's a place for full immersion. This was a building from the 6th century. That's the 500s AD. This is quite a unique baptistry. Yes, it's in the cruciform shape, but notice the two bits sticking out from the side of the pool. No one apparently knows why or what these are for. Just looking at it, seems to me it may just give the shape of a cross, but I don't know. But that was the baptistry there in that building. Our last day in Western Turkey, we spent the morning in Miletus in Acts 20, where Paul met with the elders from Ephesus to tell them goodbye. It was a distance of about 40 miles. So when they traveled from Ephesus down there, they had a good day's travel, if not a day and a half, to get to Miletus to see Paul. In the 1st century, this would have been the harbor where the trees are. Again, it's river flowing. It's long been silted up, and it's now olive groves. But that is where the harbor would have been. You're greeted, that's where I took that last picture, by the theater, which faced the harbor. And they often built theaters facing the sea because they got the cool sea breezes. And Turkey in the summer is a hot country. You notice in this picture, you see our guide in the middle, Ian Starr's Patrick Boynes. They're looking at an inscription on one of the seats. And basically it says that this section was reserved for Jews and God-fearers. So they were in attendance at the theater as well. By the way, that last photo of the theater, it was both a Greek and a Roman theater. Greek had built it into the hillside. The Romans extended it and built freestanding seats on the edges. Miletus is not on the normal tour path. It has not been well excavated. There's a Roman villa and a few other buildings that's been excavated, and the baths, the Roman baths that you see here, I believe that once again is the Frigidarium. But for Miletus, we remember the tearful parting that Paul and the Ephesian elders had here. All in all, we traveled by coach for just over 800 miles in Western Turkey. If you notice, we've not covered that much territory. Turkey is a large country. But this is the area the Apostle Paul traveled, where there were a number of communities of Christians in the 1st century. In reflection upon our tour, there's some lessons that sort of stuck out to some of us while we were on the tour, and some of I've thought of since then. Just because a place has a large community of Christians today does not mean that will continue. There are large communities of Christians there in the 1st century. There's nothing there today. And sometimes Christian communities die out. Sometimes it's because there is no outreach. As the letters to the congregations in Revelation point out, this is Jesus removing their lampstand. They're not remaining faithful. At other times, though, an entire area's population dwindles. We might think of the coal mining communities in Scotland and the number of good-sized congregations that used to be there. And today, the congregations do not exist. Having said that, neither do much of the communities. Often it's wise, as the population leaves and there's nobody left, that you go elsewhere to worship other congregations. One thing we need to realize, it's not up to us to decide for other congregations when they should close their doors. But we need to do what we can to encourage Christians everywhere. And we especially need to plan for the growth of the congregation where we are. Many of us are in aging congregations in the UK. What are we doing to ensure that this Christian community continues? When you read through the letters to the 7 congregations in Revelation 2 and 3, you discover they faced real persecution, even faced death, and also had to deal with people trying to lead others away from Jesus. They had to stand up against all of that. Now, we face struggles of various types living Christian lives today. Maybe not the persecution to the extent that they did, but we do have pressures against us. The pressures of the world seem to be very intense right now. But we need to keep going, as Jesus told them to keep going. And in each of these letters, Jesus gave a message of encouragement. And those messages are applicable to us today. Listen to what he wrote to these 7 congregations. To the one who is victorious, I will give the right to eat from the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. Be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown. To the one who's victorious, I will give some of the hidden manna. To the one who's victorious and does my will to the end, I will give authority over the nations. I will also give that one the morning star. To the one who's victorious, or the one who is victorious, will be dressed in white. I will never blot out the name of that person from the book of life, but will acknowledge that name before my Father and his angels. The one who is victorious, I will make a pillar in the temple of my God. Never again will they leave it. I will write on them the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which is coming down out of heaven from my God. And I will also write on them my new name. To the one who is victorious, I will give the right to sit with me on my throne, just as I was victorious and sat down with my Father on his throne. When we hear phrases like that, it tells us that no matter how bad it is, Jesus is there cheering for us. He has done what he can to ensure that we have the means to live faithfully for him. Each of these letters, by the way, ends with the same phrase: whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the congregations. And we all have ears, do we not? We need to listen to what the Spirit has revealed to us in the pages of Scripture. No matter where we are reading and studying in Scripture, there are lessons for us to learn. There are things that we need to apply to our lives. There are changes that we need to make. Although the New Testament was written to Christians who lived long ago, in essence, these words were also written for us. This is why God preserved what we have in our New Testament. Yes, there were other letters written. Laodicea even received one. But God preserved what we needed. We have what we need to live faithful lives for him. Let's devote time daily to God's word. If we do that, we'll grow. It can only improve our lives for him as we listen to the ancient words that God has left for us.